But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. Welcome to the History in Motion podcast. On today's episode, we're diving into the life of Genghis Khan, a warrior, a conqueror, and the mastermind behind the largest land empire in history. From his harsh beginnings on the Mongolian steppes to his unstoppable rise to power, his story is one of ambition, strategy, and sheer force of will. How did he unite warring tribes, outmaneuver his enemies, and leave a legacy that still shapes the world today? Let's find out. This is History in Motion.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where we're moving ourselves east today into Mongolia, where we're going to spend some time with the Mongols. And if you know anything about the Mongols, you can probably guess who we're going to talk about today, and that's the famous Genghis Khan, or better known as Genghis Khan, if you want to get into the Mongolian pronunciation. And, you know, I think the introduction that I can give here is he is the greatest conqueror of all time. Full stop. There's nothing really more to add. But what we're really interested today is to understand, you know, how does one become the greatest conqueror of all time? And I think coming into this, we know he conquered a lot of land, but how did he do it? Why did he do it? And who is he as a person? I think is the things we're going to try to get into today, because there's not a lot known about him, maybe on the personal level, but his achievements are very well documented. And, you know, the fear of these Mongol hordes coming over the horizon is, you know, you talk to somebody in China and you talk to someone in Eastern Europe, and they're going to have both this massive fear over the Mongols. So, you know, you're separated by thousands and thousands of thousands of miles, but you both know who the Mongolians are. I think it goes to show that, you know, these are some guys that aren't to be messed with. And it really starts with Genghis Khan and his growth of this massive, massive empire.
Yeah, I'm honestly surprised it took us this long to get to him, to be honest with you, as the greatest conqueror. So we're going to have to do this one some justice. And I think it's probably good to punctuate that point, which is, yeah, in reality, he is the greatest conqueror of all time. And we've talked about some pretty heavy hitters on this podcast so far. And, you know, he reigns above them all in terms of what he was able to do. I think the other interesting part about this episode, because I tackled the context, is just, you know, we're talking about the 1200s. We're talking about the Mongolian steppe, and it's a world so different than what I think most people on this side of the globe are taught about. So to be able to contextualize and understand what that environment looks like is also such an interesting silver lining of this type of episode.
Absolutely, because especially if we're talking, you know, 12th century, 13th century, and if we think of, we talked about the Crusades around that time, big walls of Jerusalem, you know, we've talked about the Roman Empire 1,000 years earlier, building these massive cities, massive fortresses. But then you have something that's completely different and what almost would seem like a somewhat primitive society, just based on the fact that they aren't building in cities in the way that the Chinese are, for example. But when it comes to military conquest and the ability to join together and the tactical genius that's coming out of what the Mongolians are able to do, it's not that they're primitive in any way at all. It's they are just in a very unique part of the world, and they've adapted so well to where their terrain is and what they need to do. They don't need to build cities. It's just not what they're going to do. And you start to see them build out these really unique ways of fighting and the really unique ways of unifying themselves. And so when they show up on the door of the Chinese or move into Persia or eventually make their way to Europe, you know, it's something to be trifled with. And you can see all around the world at this point, all around Asia, Europe, the Middle East, nobody knows how to handle these guys because they're just so good at what they do. And they're so unique in that sense.
Yeah. And I think, you know, what we're really getting at here is that, you know, the story of Genghis Khan and the geography or the geographic realities of the steppe are intentionally coupled. And, you know, you can't tell the story of one without the other, because the geography and the environment play such a crucial role in how things actually ended up panning out. And, you know, the impact that it had on like geopolitical relations between all these different tribes that he ended up unifying. And, you know, maybe as a starting point, we can talk about the Mongolian steppe a little bit. So before we hopped on, we were talking about the size of the Mongolian steppe. So in sheer like volume, it's over 800,000 square kilometers. It's bigger than France. It is roughly the size of Texas and California combined, right? So the sheer size of it is really hard to, wrap your head around, because there's no real boundaries, right? These are warring tribes that are nomadic in nature. And if you look at the geography and the climate, it's essentially endless grasslands, right? It's covered by short grasses and shrubs with very few trees. It's a pretty harsh climate depending on the season. In summers, you're going to experience up to 40 degrees Celsius, and cold winters, anywhere from -40 on the other end. Very strong winds, very little rainfall, and it makes life on the steppe very challenging because you're going to get droughts, you're going to get very harsh winters, and there's also very few rivers and lakes. There's the Onan, the Kurlan, and Tul rivers are among the few major water sources in Mongolia. So this kind of leads to, this nomadic way of life. You have a herding culture for over 1,000 years. These Mongolian nomads have relied on horses, sheep, goat, camels, yaks, and cattle for food, clothing, and transportation. They also have portable homes. So they're called gurs or yurts. And these are kind of traditional Mongolian huts in some way, or circular tents made of felt and wood that can be easily moved when they're migrating to new pastures or, the season's changing. Something we'll get to that's, I think what the Mongols are known for is horsemanship. So the Mongolian steppe is essentially the land of horses. They learn to ride at a very young age, and there's been historically some of the best horsemen and archers on horseback ever recorded in history. And obviously the other historical points relative to this episode is that it's the birthplace of Genghis Khan. This was the home to one of the greatest conquerors who ended up unifying all the Mongol tribes in the 12th and 13th centuries.
It's interesting as you were talking there I was just thinking about this nomadic lifestyle that seemed like there really was no other option, because we think of, big European cities, big Asian cities, they're built on rivers, they're starting to cultivate farms. They're building large wooden structures. Well, if you're on the steppe, you don't have much rainfall. Farming is going to be very difficult, and you don't got a lot of wood. So I don't know what you're building out of some stone, but again, it just creates this, if you got a lot of animals running around, you're really good on horseback, you're really good at being mobile. It just kind of creates this environment for them that's, really so perfect. And I think your point on the horseback element of this is so interesting, because we've seen in history large empires, and I think of the Romans, whenever they ran into archers on horseback, they always seemed to struggle. And, something that the Persians did very well, and the Parthians. But as you kind of look at what the Mongolians are doing, this is a completely different animal when it comes to skill. Like, there's even reports of Mongolian horse archers who are think of they're riding a horse and they're using the neck and head of the horse as like a shield, and they're shooting their bow while bent underneath the head of the horse while riding and still being able to maneuver. Just the ability to, not just one person can do that for show. This is an army of them who are doing it in a synchronized way to destroy an enemy. You're not going to stand a chance against that if you've got tens of thousands of these guys rolling in on horses that they basically live in. They say they're born in the saddle, they live in the saddle, and this is what these guys did. And somebody can find a way to unify these guys. They're going to be a formidable fighting force. And I think everybody, especially the Chinese, they definitely know that that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, and I think I even read, and again, take this with a grain of salt, but that some archers were known to have hit targets up to 200 meters away from them, which is very hard to imagine, but I love the idea of it. Obviously, there might be some historical leaps taken there with the actual measurement of it. But I think it just goes to show that for the Mongols, and not just the Mongols, because there's other tribes here too, right? Survival is very much a full-time occupation to live off the land and to ensure that your community is going to not just survive, but actually thrive to some capacity. And that's why they were pastoral nomads. So again, they relied on their animals for almost everything. They herded horses, sheep, goat, cattle, and camels. And that was multifactorial because these animals would serve for transport purposes, food, clothing, and even, building the tents. So every few months, these families would essentially dismantle their gear, seemed to be pretty quick. And then they'd, load it onto ox carts and then move however far away to a new pasture where they would restart again. And then they'd had to contend while doing all of this. They had to rely on fresh grass and water for their livestock, but water's pretty limited in the steppe. And they're still contending with very harsh climatic realities that they can't do anything about. And they didn't really have permanent stores of grain or large food reserves. Typically, when we've talked about societies or civilizations, there's an infrastructure in place with cities and some sort of administration or bureaucracy. I'm sure elements of that existed, but it's not like the more Western examples that we talk about, where there's massive granaries and deposits of food that are going to be held over from harvest to harvest so that, you can ensure you're going to eat in the winter. That's just not a reality for the Mongols.
And I think one thing that's very interesting is the concept concept of wealth for a Mongol. They don't have stores of gold that they're lugging around. Like, you can only carry so much at some point. So really what ends up being a source of wealth for them is their animals. If you have a lot of horses, if you're able to have a lot of ox and those sort of things, very useful types of things, is a way of demonstrating but also cultivating wealth. But there's a problem with that, is it's limited in what you can actually take. You have to feed these things. You have to have enough people to physically herd them. And it kind of limits the power from a financial standpoint that a lot of these Mongol tribes can get to. So, they're not building palaces or anything like that, A, because obviously they're nomadic, but B, there isn't this excess of wealth that they have that they're just trying to find a way to spend it, like you would see in China, or you would see in Europe, or even in parts of the Middle East. So they're very unique in that sense that everything that's kind of useful and valuable to them really comes from a nomadic, animal-based economy, if you will. And that's really going to be important to remember as we go forward and they start to move into places like China and to Persia, because there's a lot of things that aren't nailed down that you can take from those places. And it's going to completely transform the way that economy is going to look, with all the plunder that they're able to grab. But this is who the Mongols are at this time. And it's, things are going to change, but it's tough to really be able to settle down and use all of that wealth to build or do, farming, cities, all those sort of things, just based on this nomadic, animal-based economy.
And you know what's interesting? I think the way these conversations typically go when we talk about nomadic tribes living off of the land, eating your animals, herding them, I'm not a huge fan of the word like barbarous or barbarian, because I think it's like intellectually short-sighted. So one of the interesting things that I came across was around like the family dynamics and social dynamics of Mongol tribes. Apparently, hospitality was a cornerstone of steppe life. So it's actually documented that there was a common tradition. So if any traveler or stranger kind of arrived at camp, they would be invited into, someone's gur or yurt for some warm heat. And it was customary to offer bowls of dried cheese and to go as far as actually slaughtering cattle, horse, or a goat, and then boiling it to have a massive dinner and feast to honor your guest. So I think, when we think of Mongols, the first sentiment that comes to my mind is violence and war and archery, right? And I think those are elements that are correct, but it doesn't paint a full picture. And I think even in that vein, right, there's the family structure, which is interesting too. And the reason I bring this up, and I'd mentioned it to Paul before we started recording, is that there were some similarities that struck out to me around how these nomadic tribes in the steppe do share some similarities with nomadic tribes in North America. So I know from indigenous tribes in Canada, there's this element of kind of a strong matriarchal presence in what we were taught in Canadian history. And uniquely enough, with the family structure for the Mongols, it was patriarchal, but it was pragmatic. So several generations would live together, which is pretty typical of nomadic tribes. But when the men were off raiding, warring, sieging, hunting, the women would be left in charge to make all major decisions without any oversight around what was going to happen in the community, settle any disputes, and make sure that, operations daily just kind of kept functioning so nothing bad would happen for when the men came back. So I think it does add a new layer of kind of context and balance that you don't typically hear about the Mongols, because we always go to the warring and bloodshed as the default.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, I think you mentioned it early on, is everything's really based around survival, this tough climate. It's almost like they didn't have time to mess around with, it's really suppressing people and putting one person in charge of everything and, going through some useless bureaucracy. It was like, well, the men are off hunting or fighting. Well, we got to take care of things and we'll deal with it and we'll make it work because we have to survive. And there's no way to really do this. So I always find that interesting that maybe, you don't have as much time for some of that infighting because there's work to do and you got to do it because life depends on it, especially in this specific climate that they're facing. One other thing I wanted to mention is just before we came on the podcast, I was like, I'm like, what year was the Great Wall of China built? And we just took a quick look at it and we're like, right, it wasn't just built in a year or two or something like that. It was built in pieces, various versions of it, what looked like over 2,000 years. And if you look at where these walls were built, typically right along the Mongolian border. And so the main parts of the Great Wall of China are built after Genghis Khan. So probably tells you all you need to know about him. But what I think is really interesting is there's enough documented in Chinese history where they find themselves coming into these Mongolian tribes and making sure they don't unify, because the Chinese are very aware of how powerful these guys are. if they're able to unify. And so up to this point, you've got all these fractured tribes doing their own thing, doing their own nomadic thing, fighting against each other, not really unified or just kind of isolated. And the Chinese are really monitoring this. And every time it seems like there's a threat, they seem to find a way to get in there and get them fighting against each other at some point. And so the biggest piece here is the Chinese know what could potentially be coming here, and they're spending a lot of resources to make sure that it doesn't happen. And because clearly when it does happen, it becomes a complete disaster for them, to the point where they spend hundreds of years building walls to keep the Mongolians out, because you can only get them fighting for so long, and eventually, we might get someone who's going to unify them.
I think that's such an interesting point, right? And I think just to set the context, I'll just dovetail off that, which is the context that we've set so far makes them seem very isolated in this far off land. It's true to a certain extent, right? In the same vein, there's also another reality that exists in parallel, which is they're not totally cut off from neighboring cultures. There is a steady, maybe sparse, but steady enough stream of interaction with other civilizations around them. So you could have trading caravans from the Silk Road occasionally crossing the steppe, or enterprising merchants that are Chinese, Muslim, or Uyghur. They might visit a Mongol camp, for example, to come barter. And then nomads, obviously they traded animal products like furs, hides, amber, or horns for goods that they couldn't produce, for things like metal, for arrowheads and cooking pots. So even in respect, there is an element of interconnectivity that I don't think we'd associate with it. To go as far as that even a few Mongol tribes had adopted Nestorian Christianity from missionaries who had traveled those silk routes. So you're already seeing this kind of, early globalism appearing, even, in somewhere as isolated as the Mongolian steppe.
Yeah, I think a good way to think about it is they're not far from a lot of things, but they're in a very low density area. So there's not a lot going on where they live other than them, but it's not too far away from China or the Silk Road, like some of the things you mentioned. And the fact that Christianity has made its way there, when it really even hasn't really established itself as hard as maybe obviously it will become in parts of Russia and those sort of places. So yeah, it's good, I think, to kind of set that context, because they don't just come across, oh, look, the Chinese are here when they're ready. They very well know that the Chinese they know the Persians are there, or the empire that's in Persia at this time. So they're ready for this sort of stuff, but they've just got a lot of space kind of to themselves, and they try to make the most of it.
Exactly. And I think in terms of context, I think that kind of scopes it out well enough for us to introduce the main character of the conversation now and the world that he's coming into. Yeah,
I think you've done a pretty good job there, kind of overlaying everything here. And I think it's important because as we see him kind of go through his younger life here, it's going to be very important to kind of understand what he's kind of growing up into and how he's able to take what's there and turn it into one of the greatest land armies the world's ever seen in a pretty short period of time, which I think is kind of one of those things. It's this sleeping giant that's there, and it just needs some help. If it can get unified and get a great leader, it's going to explode into something. So before we start talking about Genghis Khan, we have to talk about Temüjin. And so Temüjin is actually Genghis Khan's birth name. And that's what I'm going to be referring him to for the first bit of his story here. The reason for that is Genghis Khan is a title that he was given, but his name is actually Temüjin. And I think it helps tell the story if we refer to him as Temüjin before he becomes Genghis Khan, because it's a nice way to separate those two parts of his life, kind of be seen as two separate people. There's the young man who's just trying to find his way in the world to the greatest conqueror of all time. So we're going to start with that. So Temüjin was born to a noble lineage. His father was the chief of a clan, and his mother was from a strong nomadic tribe. But nobility in the steppe, it didn't really guarantee safety like you might think. So when Temüjin was 9 years old, his father was poisoned by an enemy while traveling. And so right away, family fortunes crumble. He's fatherless, vulnerable, and basically his own tribe even betrays his family. They saw the widow and her children, so the widow being his mother, and her children as weak with no strong male to lead them. So they were essentially abandoned. Their livestock was seized, and they were forced to be living on their own. And so think of, a mother and a child in this vast open space trying to figure out ways to survive. And you hear stories of them eating wild roots and fish because it had no animals to slaughter. And, just saying he grew up in this poor, harsh environment with people around him betraying him. Obviously this makes a great leader. Like, what a great story for a great leader. And you're probably thinking right now, it's almost too perfect. It's almost too good to be true. And the answer is most likely yes. This is all coming from something called The Secret History of the Mongols. And it's really the only source that we have on Temüjin's life as a young boy. And historians can't really make heads or tails of it in terms of its accuracy. There's nothing to really back it up. So we kind of have to take everything as a bit of a myth at this point, as this may have happened. He may have gone through this really hard life. He may just have had a regular childhood and was able to do what he did. But these are the stories that you start to hear of just, him, being born to this, really tough environment and having to find a way to survive. And it all comes from this secret history.
It's very interesting because it's not that unbelievable of a story, right? And I think that's probably one of the more interesting things about that is that what else would a woman in this world do without a husband who has no money or riches, right? Like it's totally about survival. So it could be potentially made up, but I think, there is always an interesting element in the scarcity of someone's childhood that they have to endure that could impact the actions they take in their later life. And, I think we've seen a lot of that in other episodes.
Absolutely. And I think it tells a story. I think even if these things aren't perfectly true, it tells enough of a story about how people within that time period were thinking about him and like what would someone who became Genghis Khan have to go through in a kind of more storytelling type of way. And I think it does a good job of kind of setting the scene for that. And there's another story about him as a young man. He's captured by a rival clan. He's got the collar around his neck, being dragged around. Basically, looks like he's going to be a slave the rest of his life. But, one night he sees that the guards are careless. He knocks one of them out, flees into the darkness. They try to find him. Someone spots him, but one local man was so impressed by the defiant fire in his eyes that instead of turning him in, he helped the boy hide and escape at great personal risk. And, this is the turning point for his life. And so, hey, maybe it's true. Maybe he was that great at a young age, but we don't know for sure. But again, I think it tells a bit of a story to kind of explain his life. And then when we start to get into what historians start to think are a little bit more true stories, and I think this one definitely makes sense, is, within these tribes, family tensions arise. And so he actually gets in a conflict with his older half-brother over food, authority within a small family unit, and essentially ends with Temüjin killing his half-brother to prevent him from asserting dominance. And so this is, I think, a pretty stark reality of this life on the steppe. We talked about these nomadic tribes, but what that means is you're dividing the people into smaller and smaller groups, and then within those groups, they're going to start dividing themselves. And family units, as we clearly saw by that opening story, it matters. And blood relations, all of these sort of things are really important, and it can be enough that fighting within families is going to be something that kind of happens all the time. And we can see here, having to kill your half brother over food and authority within a small family unit is just kind of shows the violent nature of life on the steppes and, the types of decisions that you have to do.
Yeah, I think the word that comes to mind when you're looking at not just it at the tribe family level, but if you take it more broadly around the other nomadic tribes that exist, it's chaotic. Like it is a very delicate dance for the balance of power and the constantly shifting alliances. And, it ultimately leads in like endless conflict because there is no unifier. But I think it just goes to show how much violence and chaos kind of reigned against each one of these tribes, always having to, one, defend themselves against any warring tribe with alliances always shifting. But then at the same time, having that internal pressure of being unified so that you're not getting taken advantage of and someone's, taking, that opportunity to attack you when you're at your weakest with no leadership.
Absolutely. And these rivalries and these alliances come and go and jealousy starts and everything you can possibly imagine when you don't have a traditional, maybe nobility to fall back into or a royal family to follow or really standardized groups to put everybody in. There's those shifting, and I think family ends up being what that is, and the tribe ends up being that. But like you said, it's going to change and move all the time. And so coming back to Temüjin, one good thing for him was before his father had died, he arranged a marriage for him when he was very, very young. And so he becomes of age, his wife becomes of age, and he gets married. And his wife is actually said to be someone that he truly loved, and they had a very happy union together, and they were very close. He really relied on her for a lot throughout his life in terms of advice and guidance and those sort of things. But right after they get married, she's actually kidnapped by a rival tribe. And, this tribe had an old grudge against Temüjin's father. The story goes that Temüjin's father had either stolen/eloped with Temüjin's mother from a person in this tribe. And so now this is like some old score that they're trying to settle. So they take her away in some quick kind of ambush battle that happens. And Temüjin has a pretty big choice to make here. He's outnumbered. He knows that his odds of survival are really low. So he has two options. He can try to save his wife in this situation or allow her to be kidnapped, retreat, lick his wounds and come back and figure it out. And for a place where definitely honor is important and being seen as strong is important, he makes a decision to flee, not out of cowardice because he figures out what he needs to do. He goes and gathers allies and those sort of things, but he decides, what's the point? I'm going to get killed here anyways. No sense being silly and doing something dumb. I'm going to come back and try it again. But it's a tough decision, right? Because you can already start to see he's not just this, what we think of a Mongol running headfirst into anything, just out for blood. He's a very smart, calculated person who's willing to sacrifice some of that short-term honor to make something happen in the future that's going to be better for him and actually lead to success, him alive and his wife alive.
I think that's a very interesting move, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but like that honor culture element plus what the expectations are for someone in battle or who's been wronged by, an opposing tribe is that they're supposed to take violence head on, right? So it is an interesting break from tradition, but I think it also showcases that kind of element of strategic thinking. Like, am I just going to go die for nothing right now? Or am I going to go back and then actually, effectively do something about this?
Absolutely. And that's exactly what he does. He as soon as this happens, he goes, I need help. I can't take these guys on by myself. So I'm going to go to two people. So he goes to Torgil Khan, who was a old ally of his father, and a man named Jamuka. And Jamuka is actually Temüjin's childhood friend and basically seen as this blood brother. And there's actually a word in Mongolian called anda, which basically means sworn brother. And you really start to see this level of loyalty and this we're blood brothers, that this unbreakable bond between two different men where it's not just a, hey, we're in an alliance, let's shake hands. This is, a bond of blood and a bond that can never be broken. And so he's definitely going to have Jamuka on his side. Tongral Khan, Temüjin offers him a sable fur, a gift that he received at his wedding as a symbolic gesture, and it seems to pay off. So he's able to gain his loyalty as well. And there's a story that he's given almost 20,000 warriors, again, numbers to be taken with a grain of salt, to help in this rescue mission. And they're able to do that. They successfully rescue his wife, and soon after she gives birth to their first son. Now, there is some historical speculation that the son was actually not Temüjin's son. She was impregnated while she was in captivity. Didn't matter though. Temüjin accepted the child as his own and would always be seen that way going forward. So this really puts Temüjin into people's eyes. Like, okay, not only is he able to bring allies together, but he's able to win back, obviously, honor for himself, win back his wife, and beat a decently sized tribe in battle. It's not a very big operation, but it's enough to kind of get his reputation moving. So, he's really not just this orphan without a father looking for his life. He's starting to make a name for himself. But as people start to make name for themselves, people start to get jealous. Jamuka, his long friend, blood brother, he's not a big fan at this point. He's really more traditional. He's clinging to the old ways, and he comes from some aristocracy, and he's starting to look at Temüjin going like, all right, buddy, I get it. You're doing all these things, but you're not from the aristocracy like I am. This is not going to work. And really they're not, they're starting to drift apart to a point where they become open rivals and actually meet each other in battle. And Temüjin's defeated pretty badly in this, and he barely escapes with his life. And so he's trying to figure out now what happens, because after this defeat, Temüjin's now alone again. He needs to figure out what to do. There's even some stories that he took refuge in northern China to kind of lick his wounds and then get back into things. But again, this is how quickly things can change. He's feeling that he's on the rise. He's got people in his corner that are important to him. And then those relationships break down. He loses a battle and he's back to basically having nothing again. And he's got to try to crawl, all the way back up to get to a point where just not only to recover what he needed, but, to start building on what he hoped he was going to be able to build on.
It's interesting because at the onset of what you were saying, right, the view of the other members of the tribes and how he's starting to kind of fill this gap as, a potential leader who might be the unifying force for all the tribes. I think it really does tell us something very interesting about what's going, like the geopolitical realities, is that there may have been like a need or desire amongst, tribes members, maybe not the leaders of tribes, because then they know it's, their chances are going to be slimmer, but like amongst the common folk of the steppe, the value and validity that they would get if they did have a unified leader and someone like Temüjin kind of stepping up to fill that gap.
There's definitely a bit of a hunger there of people kind of just going about being like, hey, I want to get in on something, but how do I do it? Oh, this guy seems like he knows what he's doing. And that's kind of what happens. So he licks his wounds, he comes back, And it's just a slow burn where he's bringing some forces in under his control. He's forging new alliances, and he's starting to really see what it takes to be a leader. One thing they say about Temüjin and eventually when he becomes Genghis Khan is his leadership ability and his ability to learn from defeat. He's able to adapt his tactics, but he's also really good at just listening to people around him. He takes in people all the time, and he's not someone who's very stubborn, at least at this point in his life. He's trying to learn and get back on the scenes. And by the mid 1190s, he's back on the scene, and he's trying to unify, not necessarily think he's probably going to unify all the Mongols, but he's trying to unify some sort of clan so he can get revenge as he goes along. And he continues to do that. He targets rival clans, uses a mix of diplomacy, strategy, and obviously force, and ruthless force when necessary. And, a pattern emerges where he would eliminate an enemy leader, incorporate the common people into his tribe, effectively growing his army with each victory. And so it's important because he's taking over clans, murdering the top leaders, but then he's bringing these people into his tribe. So he's using it as a way to grow, but also to kind of stamp out any potential resistance. By doing that, though, the ruthlessness starts to come out. And so we'll see this theme with him throughout his entire life. And there's a story about how he was away from his camp. This other clan came that he was supposed to be allies with, betrayed him, plundered the camp, took a bunch of stuff, murdered a bunch of people. And so when he returns, obviously gathers his forces and goes and attacks them and essentially executes the entire nobility of this tribe and absorbs the rest of his people into his protection. But like, it's a quick, off with their head sort of thing. And this is where this clear message starts with him. Loyalty will be rewarded. If you're loyal to him, no matter who you are, you will be rewarded. But if you betray him or you resist him in any way, not only will you be crushed, everybody will be destroyed brutally. And that is the theme of the Mongols under Genghis Khan and Temüjin for the rest of his life. And that's the central theme, I think, with him is you're loyal, I'll give you what you need. But if you even think about betraying me, I will destroy you with, the entire might of my armies.
It's a very strategic decision, right? I think contextually, based on what I read, it's a pretty common practice that we've kind of covered in other episodes, which is as an invading force, makes sense to co-opt some of the people that you're now ruling over, but to make sure that you're also eliminating any potential threats, right? So maybe the more senior male leadership of that tribe might get executed, but anyone under the age of 14 is now under the rule of Temüjin. And I think it's maybe just a quick point on all the different tribes here, right? I know we're kind of centered on Mongols, and obviously they're kind of the key players. But if we're looking at the Mongols as kind of the center of our world right now, to the south and east, you have the Jin dynasty, so that's northern China. To the southwest, you have the Western Xia kingdom. This is kind of like a Buddhist, Tibetan kingdom that kind of broke off from China a while ago. And then to the west, you have the Kara-Kitai Empire, which is the remnant of an old rule in northern China that's now based in Central Asia. So you have all these geopolitical factions that are, trying to influence what's going on here at the same time.
Yeah, everybody's kind of got their piece to all of this, and to try to find your place in all this is going to be really difficult. And, I think part of it too is just the aura, I guess, of Temüjin, right? As he's starting to get people to start talking about him. And part of that is not only by his brilliance, but by, his ruthlessness. And it's funny, Richie, you said, we'll get rid of the men, but maybe anybody under 14 is saved. Not always the case. So if we remember, his father was poisoned by a tribe called the Tartars. And so he ends up getting into battle with them and basically destroys their army. But this is where he gets brutal. Calculated for sure, but it's also a personal vendetta. The story goes that he lined up all the men, and if their head was above the wheel of an ox cart, they were put to death. Anybody under that was not put to death. So basically only young children. They think anyone under the age 10 and older was executed in this time. And this is part of his, genocidal, almost in a way, strategic goal of not only eliminating current threats, but getting rid of future threats and sending a message to everybody that, you cross him, you cross his family, you will be destroyed, your children will be killed. Anybody who could potentially rise up against me, will be killed. And again, everybody he's taking in from this tribe is so young, they probably don't even remember, life before that. So what do they know? And it's very calculated, but, incredibly ruthless.
Extremely calculated. And I think it's probably worth mentioning why. So the Tartars are one of the key other tribes outside of the empires I just listed earlier that are very powerful, but they're also very volatile on the steppe. and they're known for constantly shifting alliances when convenient. So they're also longtime rivals of the Mongols, and they were often manipulated by larger powers. So the Jin dynasty kind of had a lot of influence and puppet mastery over the Tartars, and they kind of armed them to keep other steppe tribes in check at the same time. So, using them against each other. But despite their strength, their history was often marked by betrayal. So they often played ally and enemy to different tribes or different factions, just depending on the time, including the Mongols themselves.
It's definitely clever from the Chinese. They, again, like we mentioned, they know what's happening, but you can see here that, maybe some people are like, they got what was coming to them, but, to start murdering children is, even no matter how much you hate this tribe, you're probably going to be questioning things and looking at this in a different way. But hey, this is a big win for him right now. He's just eliminating very large tribes, people that are against him. And he's got one last rival to deal with, and that's Jamuka. So Jamuka is still around with his rivals, and they face off in this final confrontation. But by now, Jamuka's lost a lot of followers. They've defected to Temüjin, and they kind of saw the way the wind was blowing. So Temüjin's forces defeat Jamuka, and he was eventually captured. And here, Temüjin actually shows a flash of personal emotion. And once he was defeated, he offered to forgive him and restore their bond and say, hey, you're going to be back in my, maybe not good circles, but I'm not going to execute you, basically. And according to legend, Jamuka refused, and he asked for an honorable death. And what he meant by an honorable death, and we don't really know how this works, but he said, kill me, but don't spill any of my blood, which is strange in its own sense. So the rumor is that they found a way to break his back really badly, and that was able to kill him and not shed blood. I don't really know exactly how this works, but that was what he wanted, and eventually was killed in that sense. It's a very strange way to go and say, yeah, I want to die, but don't spill my blood. And I'm not going to pretend to know what's going on that side of things. But basically, all his rivals are defeated now. He's the king of Mongolia, or the Mongols at this point, and he's ready to take that next step into, how do I build this thing into some sort of empire? And I'm going to need a better name than just Temüjin.
I think this might be an interesting pivot to how this was all done, with like the warring tribes and what this actually looks like. So I know one of the almost immediate thoughts that people have when they start talking about the Mongols is warfare tactics, horses, and archery. I don't think I've had a conversation where the Mongols are brought up and then the subsequent points are not brought up like right after the fact. And I think that's definitely really tells you a lot about how effective they were with their tactics. And again, I think we mentioned at the onset, but warfare is very much a way of life for the Mongols, long before Temüjin even, right? Every nomadic boy is essentially a soldier in training from the time that they're born. This is just how it works. They're learning to ride at full gallop while shooting arrows by the time, they're like 12. And in a land with like no fortresses or fixed assets, battles are all about mobility, skill, and psychological advantage. So it's not the typical type of static siege or rank and file infantry changes that we're talking about. The Mongols and their rivals affected the art of mounted warfare. They were horse archers at like the peak of what was, what could be done on horseback with bow and arrow. And perhaps even, the best that we'll ever see at this point. So, this is where the stories come out about, how armies would be terrified of a cloud of arrows raining down on them by massive amounts of Mongols, or, being able to kill an enemy 200 meters away while charging the line, not sitting, off kilter on your horse and still being able to hit a moving target. So it just goes to show how deeply entrenched this military and culture is within the community. And I think another point worth mentioning is probably around the honor culture aspect, I think, that we touched on so far, right? So in the same respect, what this actually looks like outside of, waging war and, being there within your tribes when you're actually in a battle is this element of personal courage and skill that are prized in battle. There's such a culture of respect and adoration around it. Mongols are expected to every man to stand his ground, even in the face of death or enemy charge. And the worst offense is to abandon your comrades in battle. So Temüjin reportedly instituted very harsh discipline. One decree was that no warrior was to loot until the battle was fully won. In earlier times, if you're a soldier and you think, it's pretty much in the bag, you run up and you start looting, and then you risk other soldiers doing the same thing. So he was really good at providing some kind of authoritative oversight so people wouldn't just do that, and really focused on what that camaraderie element would be in the frontiers of war.
I think it's really interesting. You just mentioned, you fight for the comrade beside you, and everything we just talked about a few episodes back with Robert around, morale and you're fighting for the guy in the foxhole next to you. I think it's just so fascinating that, 1,000 years earlier and those core concepts are still there. And even too, on the military side of things, you mentioned their skill, but I think for listeners, it's really important to try to picture how insanely organized they were. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these horse-drawn, archers and different types of cavalry are moving at such high speeds. And how do you know where to go? What's going to happen? Where are your orders? And so they developed series of whistles, flags. They would send messengers back and forth, and they were very, very good at maneuvering so swiftly on the battlefield. And anytime we've talked about military tactics, the ability to move quickly on the battlefield and stay organized and know what's going on is paramount. And it's the way Napoleon, for example, was so successful at what he was able to do. And I was interested in understanding, what was the training like for this? How did they get so good at it? And again, like you mentioned, Richie, they've been training for this their whole lives. And so there's the way that they actually hunted animals is really interesting. Essentially what they would do is they would span out over a few square kilometers and essentially build a big circle and start making it smaller and smaller and smaller and just start hoarding all of these animals into the center. And it was a big deal if you were the one who let an animal escape the circle, sometimes even punishable by death in some situations. But again, to be able to do this, to start moving slowly together in unison and making sure that, you're not coming in too quickly or you're sitting out on the fringes and there's a gap in your line, the animals are able to escape. They got really, really good at doing this, and they've been learning to do it since they were first able to start riding, and then eventually cornering the animals together and either killing them or hurting them away. This is warfare at it's the exact same thing, really. You're trying to work in unison to some sort of goal. And it's created this almost like a mobile strike force where you're able to just kind of point, and they're going to come in and come out. And, they had stories about them, and they would fake retreats all the time. They'd be like, oh no, these guys are running at us. And they would make it look like they were retreating, but they were so well organized that just on a commander's orders, they would flip around and come back and charge the enemy when they were off balance. And it's just, you see more stories like this where it makes sense how they were able to be obviously so ruthless, but they are just incredibly skilled, incredibly organized. And they have this military culture that goes back to, the point where you can ride a horse for the first time. And, you're going to win a lot of battles, doing this. And they continue to do it as the Mongols for centuries until firearms are created. That's what it takes. It created someone figuring out how to make guns to stop these guys. And I think what more can you say about, the incredible genius of the Mongols at this point?
I think your point on how organized and structured they were is fascinating. So I had a little blurb on this. You had mentioned signals. So how are you actually identifying what you're going to do next when you have tens of thousands of men you're leading? So this could be like a raising of a banner, like a thicket of horsehair waved in the air, perhaps the blast of a horn or the beating of a drum to a particular rhythm. And this would tell the units when to charge, flank, or retreat. And the Mongols fought in decimal units. This was inherited from older steppe traditions. So you'd have a group of 10 men, of 100, 1,000, and 10,000. And each unit had a leader at that level, which made command and control across this sprawling battlefield much easier to signal and communicate with. So highly, highly organized.
Yeah, it's really when you think of modern warfare today, you have companies and divisions, and again, this is it, right? And the ability to do that, you're right. How do you get 100,000 men to figure out what you do as well? You work through those commanders and you find a way to do it. And again, if you have a system that works and you've been fighting with similar type of people for so long, you're able to do some of these things. But, to get to that point, Temüjin, he's obviously utilizing this in such a strong way, but he's got to unify everybody, which is one thing. And he's got to do something to keep all of this together. He's killed a lot of people. A lot of people don't like him, but they respect him and they fear him. But how does he really stamp that into effect amongst the people that he's now got under his control? So first off is we got to get this guy a new name. And so a great council is called on the banks of the Onan River. And they basically acknowledge that, your authority is ultimate and we need to give you a new name as a supreme leader of the Mongols, thus being titled Genghis Khan. And we're not exactly sure what the meaning of the title is still open to some debate, but it likely means universal ruler of some type of, you are the ultimate ruler, the ultimate Khan. And I think that tells you enough of what you need to know. He's the guy in charge. And this is a new era. These Mongol tribes that the Chinese have been fearing that, would organize, and they've been spending centuries trying to make sure that they don't, are now together under one ruler for the very first time. And so this outcast boy that we think was an outcast becomes Genghis Khan and holds all this power over these people who we just talked about how formidable they are. But at the same time, like, great, they're going to come in and just steamroll everybody they fight in battle. But how are they actually going to keep everything together? And this is one of the actual unknown parts for me about Genghis Khan, was his establishing of legal codes. And so he created something called the Yasa, which means law or decree. And the Yasa was essentially a set of laws and guidelines to keep order in this newly forged empire. It covered everything from military discipline, behavior in war, to family matters and theft. The laws were enforced so strictly that, according to legend, a woman carrying a sack of gold could walk unmolested from one end of the empire to the other, which, again, woman in this time frame, walking by herself and holding gold. I don't know. It is funny how, we think about things in the 12th and 13th century, but this was just kind of to give everybody an idea of, everybody kind of bought into this and were so terrified of the punishments if they did something wrong. So, it's not a free and open society where people are talking, about, hey, I'm not a big fan of Genghis Khan, or there's no freedom of the press or anything like that. But it gets the order down and keeps things together. And one aim of this Yasa was to bind everybody together with undying obedience to the great Khan, to Genghis Khan. And by doing that, he started to eliminate these old blood feuds. So what had been causing all these tribes to fight, these old feuds that they couldn't get past, tribal vendettas, all of these sort of things. And so he also starts to bring in some things around like religious tolerance. The Mongols are very open to different religions as long as you prayed for Genghis Khan. And so they were kind of, part of it was pragmatic and how are we going to get we don't want to start trying to figure out what's the right true religion, those sort of things. But at the same time, they were like, this will cover our bases. Everybody prays for Genghis Khan from all the different religions that we have in the empire. They'll cover our bases, and, we'll be covered on, all the different gods or whatever they, those people believed in. So again, there's a long list of these things where he really starts to put, really harsh punishments for kidnapping of women, for example, enslaving any Mongol, like these things that are progressive to an extent, but are all kind of based in this fear and undying loyalty to Genghis Khan. And that's what he's going to do moving forward as he starts to move into these other territories.
It's fascinating, right? Because it seems like, he's become Genghis Khan, but there's still elements of true unification that he needs to actually manage and execute against. There's still going to be some, tribal resistance that needs to be snuffed out. He's breaking tribal loyalties in many ways because some of these tribes have been ruled by like this aristocratic lineage, each with their own power structures. So he's got to kind of abolish that and instead promote, a new system of unification based on merit and loyalty. In many ways, he's running like a master class on empire building at this point. You know what I mean? Like he's just hitting all the check boxes that we've talked about in other empire building episodes. He's reorganizing them militarily. He's putting laws in place, he's codifying them, and he's creating new opportunities within the structure he's setting up for people to live in a way where they can express their religious freedoms as freely as they want.
Absolutely. And there's even one thing I forgot to mention. He's putting in a meritocracy as well. He doesn't care who you are. You could be some guy sweeping up and you show your loyalty to him and you're capable at what you do. You're going to move all the way to the top. You have to be talented for sure. And you have to be incredibly loyal, and he's going to reward you. And again, like we mentioned at the beginning, when you're loyal to him, he will reward you. But when you betray him or you rebel against him, he's going to destroy you. So he's ready to move out of the steppes and he's ready to start turning his attention to China. And so his first campaign is against the Western Jia Empire. So they're kind of on the fringes of the Gobi Desert, not a very powerful dynasty within China, but definitely wealthy and pretty urbanized. So they came through, they attacked, but right away the Mongols don't really know how to besiege cities. This is new for them. Like they've dealt with some small cities in the past. And so this is where we see Genghis Khan's strengths. He tries to besiege the city, realizes he doesn't really have the expertise to do so. So he goes and finds a bunch of Chinese engineers in the area and basically says, teach me how to do siege properly. What do I have to build? How do we build it? And that's exactly what they do. Very quickly, they're able to figure some things out. After a siege of one of the main fortresses, they divert a stream even to flood part of the city. Really heavy fighting, and the empire or the dynasty surrenders and becomes a vassal state, giving tribute and support to the Mongols. And so again, rather than completely destroying them, he accepted their submission, probably because he knew there was a bigger prize, and this is the Jin dynasty. And this is again him not being ruthless for the sake of being ruthless. He understands that they're going to supply him with money, men, weapons, whatever he needs. And he doesn't have to expend a lot of time dealing with these guys because he wants to move on to, the big prize.
It's interesting. So the first domino essentially falls.
Yes.
Right. And now onto the second, the bigger one.
The big one. Yeah. And so this is the Jin dynasty. And so this is, along the Yellow River, the birthplace of China is, people along the Yellow River. And this is where there's a lot of money and a lot of history, artifacts, gold, jewels, whatever you can possibly imagine, silks, fabrics, everything you need to get very rich is in the Jin dynasty here. And so their main city is modern day Beijing, just to kind of give you an idea on where these guys are located. And so they launch a massive invasion in 1211. And despite there being millions of people and vast resources, they were just overwhelming. And so within about 4 years, they win a series of open battles in the plains with their superior tactical strategy from a cavalry perspective. And one by one, the forts in the city start to fall. And by 1215, they reach Beijing. And it's a long siege, but they're able to essentially get in and plunder the city. And now this is where the legend of Genghis Khan really becomes who he is. They destroy this city. I mean, civilians, military, people, surrendering. It didn't matter. Mass killings, mass plundering. And this is where, when we talk about, the word genocidal comes up with Genghis Khan a little bit. Again, it's a very specific definition, and it may or may not apply here, but this is a horrific event for the Chinese and something that people in China still talk about today from a historical perspective. And so they take the city. A lot of the Qin who are able to survive flee south, and the dynasty still exists. It was never fully finished off by Genghis. His sons actually finish it off in 1234. But by the end of the campaign, they've seized a huge part of northern China. And the biggest thing here is they've learned a lot. They've got a lot of new technology under their belts, and they are insanely rich now. They've just stolen a bunch of stuff. They've got access to all of northern China's industries. And, they've gone from being a very powerful military empire to being really strong economically as well, too. And now they can basically do whatever they want within this region and, further west.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that came up was that to address the weakness of understanding how to actually siege cities, they captured Chinese engineers to help build siege equipment, compensating for that weakness. So it's interesting, even amongst like the actual battle, the wherewithal to kind of have some foresight that we're probably going to have to do this again. Yeah. So we should figure out who's going to show us.
Exactly. And it's not just, we got to do it well this time. We got to do it and keep getting better at it, because the walls are going to be a foot higher. They're going to be a foot wider, and we got to figure out ways to get into these cities. And so they figure out how to do that. And now they are the ultimate power within, Northern Asia and moving into Central Asia at this point. And that's where we get to I'm going to try my best to say this right, the Khwarezmian Empire. Anyways, you guys get the idea. It is a large Muslim empire in Central Asia and Persia, so modern day Iran, but this empire covered pretty much most of the Stan countries. So think of Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, those countries, and large parts of Iran. And so they were led by a Shah, and the lead up to this war it's funny from a sense of just how dumb the Shah is at this point and his people. Like, what sort of intel did these guys have? Who did they think they were dealing with? Was it just bad intel? Were they just really overzealous in kind of their own abilities? But essentially, Genghis Khan sends a caravan to start establishing trade with this empire. But one of the governors of the cities seizes the caravan, accuses them of being spies, and executes all of the merchants. So Genghis Khan sends envoys to the Shah himself demanding justice, basically saying that the Shah needs to punish this rogue governor. The Shah, however, insulted by this, how dare you come and tell me what to do, kills all of Genghis Khan's envoys, and basically says there's an account saying that they were beheaded and their beards were shaved, which is an insult to them, and were sent back. And so Genghis Khan's like, all right, man, I gave you 2 shots. You've betrayed me twice, and we know what happened. So any chance of peace is evaporated at this point. He basically declared no one is safe now. His envoys, which is protected by the sacred right of messengers, has been mistreated. He gathers his army about 100,000 strong and begins the invasion of this empire, not for riches, not for more territory. I'm sure that played a factor, but the main thing is he's out for blood and he's out for revenge.
Apparently in one of these sieges, in I think the siege of Bukhara, the Mongols took a city without a fight and just used it as a supply base.
Yep. So we start to see this. It's like this domino effect of they come in and just crush one city, execute everybody in the city, and the next 10 cities just start opening their doors, going, yeah, come on in. We don't want any trouble. And again, Genghis Khan is, that's It's his MO. If you're loyal, I'll reward you. However, though, they like to keep people on their toes. One city opens their doors and they kill everybody within this city. Why? To send a message to say, hey, sometimes we're not always nice. Don't just think as you open your doors that we're going to be nice to you. Again, part of their strategy here, but he eventually takes the city with the governor who killed the merchants. And the rumor is he executed him by pouring molten silver into his eyes and ears. Again, according to legend. And when Genghis Khan enters the city, he basically says to them, he cast himself as the punishment of God. Remember, this is very deeply Muslim population, saying, I am the punishment of God, and he's chastising them for any resistance. He's basically saying, God has sent me to punish you. So don't blame me for all of this. Blame God and blame yourselves, actually, because you insulted God who sent me to destroy you and punish you. And so this is the psychological warfare that he's happening. Not only is he so ruthless, he's got this like divine piece to him of, I was sent by God to destroy you for your sins. And, you know, it's something that's going to work. And so he's still got to go get the Shah, though. So the Shah has been fleeing from city to city. He abandons his capital, which is savagely destroyed by the Mongols. And then eventually the Shah ends up finding his way into some island in the Caspian Sea and dies, essentially a fugitive, you know, in his own empire. But by 2021, this empire is in ruins. Millions of people in this empire, fraction of the, 100,000 strong Mongols essentially just steamroll this entire empire. But we can't walk away from millions potentially that were killed during this invasion. All the main centers of Islamic culture at the time, before areas in Saudi Arabia and stuff today, this was one of the great centers of Islamic culture, razed to the ground, population slaughtered. But it's just, again, technological brilliance, military brilliance, psychological tricks, incredible siege warfare at this point as well, and total war at its finest. But the human level of sacrifice here, not even sacrifice, of just slaughter, 1 million plus, potentially more, an entire empire essentially wiped off the face of the earth based on conquest, betrayal, all of those things. But this is the thing with the Mongols. For all their talents, they're efficient at essentially killing and conquering, and that's exactly what they do here.
Yeah, I think the adaptation on behalf of the Mongols to, I think you mentioned it, adapt to siege warfare, and not just adapt to it, but, become excellent at it and, perfect it, really starts to show like how motivated they are to just keep pushing every boundary they can to expand.
Yeah, and they don't stop, right? So after this, Genghis Khan doesn't actually annex it in the modern sense. He just loots everything and distributes it to his troops, making sure that everybody's got what they needed, eliminates any pockets of resistance. He actually sends 2 of his generals more westward, and they actually make it to modern day Georgia, where they defeat a Georgian army in battle. And they even move into Russia a little bit and start poking into Eastern Europe as a kind of a little bit of a taste what's going to come later with the Mongols. But Genghis actually turns back east at this point. That first Chinese empire, the Jia that he took, they're starting to mess around. So he has to go back and essentially crush them. And then at the age of 64, he dies. We don't necessarily know how he died. It's pretty mysterious. Some say he fell off his horse. Some say he broke a fever in the night and died. There's even a legend that he was assassinated by a captured princess, which again, fun story, but probably not true. So they think he died in around August 1227, after he defeated the Western Jia Empire again to make sure everything was okay. But we don't really know what happened to him. We know that he was buried, and in Mongol custom, the burial must be kept secret. So it's said that his funeral escort killed anyone that's witnessed the funeral escort. And they even killed animals just in case. So if a bird saw it, they would kill the bird, or a dog or something. And then they said over 1,000 horses ran over the areas where his graves were to muffle up the dirt so no one would ever find it. And to this day, we have no idea where Genghis Khan is buried. We know somewhere in Mongolia, maybe somewhere in the mountains, but we don't know. And it's one of history's, great secrets. And so that's the end of Genghis Khan. This massive empire is there. And he's done, we talked, I think, Richie, early about this, comparing him to Alexander the Great. When Alexander died, his kingdom fractured and it was pretty much over before it even started. But Genghis has put in some really great reforms. He's got everybody loyal to him, and his 4 sons actually take leadership positions and do a pretty good job of administration, and to the point where there's multiple generations of the Mongols expanding their empire, moving into the Middle East, moving more into China, getting all the way to India, and not actually going into India, but kind of getting up to that border and getting to the point where they're fighting, Europeans in Eastern Europe and coming into the Middle East and taking over and destroying some of these old caliphates that are in the Middle East. And the scene has been set by him. And now he's created this empire that really can't be stopped until really gunpowder comes around. But he's able to keep it together after his death, I think, which of all the things we've talked about, I think is probably the most astonishing piece of this whole story.
Yeah, I know our story finishes with him, but the Mongol story goes on for another like 140 years, right? 150 years after Genghis Khan dies. And it just goes to show, because the Mongol Empire, in the way that we're talking about it, lasts 162 years in total.
Which is pretty crazy that it lasted maybe 40 years under him in the sense that, by the time he took over 30 years, that's multiple generations of the world to deal with these guys and their talents. And like I said, it's technology that changes things. And also, I can only imagine how much worse it could have got, because for those who know, timelines of history, 1300s roughly in Europe, not a good time. This is the Black Death, and there is some evidence to show that the Black Death actually came via the Mongols, potentially some immunity that they had, the Europeans didn't. And the reason some people think this as well is the Mongols never made it to India, and we don't see a lot of reports of the Black Death within India, but we do see it a lot in China, and it killed millions of people in China as well. So can you imagine if they were able to keep going and, the Black Death is destroying Europe? Who knows how large this empire could have gone? But again, changes in technology, changes in a bunch of different things eventually kind of shrink that empire down to a point where, the Chinese are able to rise up again, European powers are able to rise up again. But, 160 years of just chaos really for the Chinese and the Europeans and the Muslims, pretty much everybody on the Eurasian continent is not having a good time with these guys around.
And it's all because of the foundation he put in place, right? Like without all the things and structure, foundational pieces of the empire that he laid out really gave them, or his successors, very strong footing to stand on. And I think that is probably, one of the most incredible things when we talk about that Alexander the Great comparisons again. But what happened after he died? It totally fractured and crumbled. No one wanted, anything of continuity. Whereas here, that's exactly what you get, and you get it for, 160 years.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy because I'm trying to almost justify this. Okay, his legacy, obviously one of the most important leaders of all time, the greatest conqueror of all time. But when we start talking numbers here, number of dead, he's up there. You start to throw people like Stalin and some of these guys who we actually have some pretty decent numbers on how many people they killed. He's right up there. And so he's so impressive in everything that he did, but he's so ruthless at the same time. And do you kind of just chalk it up to, it was just the times and that's what he needed to do to survive? Or was there an extra level of just being brutal for the sake of being brutal? I don't think we can fully answer that question, but it's a hard thing to justify, especially if, your ancestors were affected by all of this. And, there's a lot of people that clearly were. So it's always a tough one, I think, to walk away from this from, but, can't take away from what he was able to accomplish. But, the ruthlessness is on a level that I don't think we've talked about, for any other leader up to this point.
No. And I think, as a closing thought to that, just to keep that in consideration, historians estimate that there was about 40 to 60 million people killed, that Genghis Khan is directly responsible for. That's about 10% of the world's population at the time, and that's estimated to be around 400 to 500 million.
Yeah. 10%.
10%. Double digits.
Jeez.
Yeah.
And to do it in a non-mechanized era too, this is swords and, bows and arrows.
Yeah, these are battle numbers, right? These are not
this is manual labor, right? This is not, you're not finding some way to scale this up and do this efficiently. This is just, don't stop until everybody's dead. And it's a tough one, because it'd be interesting if, we had a little bit of the internal conversations going on in this empire of, are we being too brutal? Or was this just, no, this is what we have to do to assert our dominance on the world? And you'd probably ask Genghis Khan about this empire within Persia and this, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, that area. He basically said, look, I came in peace. I wanted to do trade. You said no. You killed my messengers. I tried to give you another chance. You killed them too. You forced my hand. How he says, you forced God's hand for me to come and destroy you because of your sins. I'm sure that would be his answer to this. And maybe he's just one of those guys where, you mess around with me, you're going to face the sword. But, I don't think the Chinese were, chopping off heads of messengers, at least in the same way, at least that we know of. There's definitely more of a calculated expansionary sort of strategic effort from him. But yeah, it's a good closing thought, I think, is to just kind of measure those two up, because it's a big number. It's
a big number. There's no denying it.
Well, I think on that front, I think it's a good time to wrap up. And I think, you've gave us some good closing thoughts, and he's quite the guy, and he definitely, his reputation precedes him, and for good reason. And, there's a lot more to do with the Mongolians and people that cross his path. So I'm not 100% sure where we're going to go next week, but we might be going back to this era in this area of the world again. So tune in next time for a little bit more around this part of the world.
Awesome. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.